The morning mist hung low over Pearl Harbor like a delicate veil, concealing what would become one of the most infamous days in American history. It was Sunday, December 7th, 1941, and the Hawaiian sun had not yet burned away. The dawn's gentle shroud when Commander Mitsuo Fukita adjusted his flight goggles and peered down at the massive naval base spread below like a sleeping giant dot at Hickam Field. Staff Sergeant Joseph Lockard was completing what should have been a routine shift at the mobile radar station. The green blips on his screen had been showing unusual activity since early morning, but his superiors had dismissed his concerns. Probably just a flight of B-17s coming in from the mainland, Lieutenant Kermit Tyler had told him over the phone. The young radar operator couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Meanwhile, aboard the battleship USS Arizona, Seaman First Class Donald Stratton was preparing for what he expected to be another peaceful Sunday. The ship's crew had settled into the comfortable rhythm of peacetime naval life, with many sailors planning to attend church services or write letters home. Captain Franklin Van Valkenburg had just finished his morning coffee in the wardroom when the first distant drone of aircraft engines began to echo across the harbor. The Japanese strike force had been meticulously planned for months under the code name Operation Hawaii, later renamed Operation Z. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the brilliant architect of this audacious attack, had spent countless hours studying American naval capabilities and weaknesses. His goal was not merely tactical but psychological, to deliver such a devastating blow that America would lose the will to fight in the Pacific. As referenced in historical accounts from the Pearl Harbor National Memorial Archives, the Japanese had launched their attack from 6 aircraft carriers, positioned approximately 200 miles north of Oahu. The first wave consisted of 183 aircraft, including Nakajima B-5 and Kate torpedo bombers, a GD-3 Aval dive bombers, and Mitsubishi A-6M0 fighters. Commander Fukita, leading the aerial armada, could see the orderly rows of battleships moored along Ford Island's eastern shore, their gray hulls gleaming in the morning light. The sight filled him with both professional satisfaction and deep unease. He knew that in minutes, this tranquil scene would erupt into chaos and death. Below, Petty Officer 3rd Class Doris Miller was serving breakfast aboard the USS West Virginia when he noticed something peculiar about the approaching aircraft. The young African-American sailor, who would later become one of the day's most celebrated heroes, initially thought the planes were conducting training exercises. The red circles painted on their wings seemed too bright, too foreign to belong to American aircraft. At exactly 7:55 in the morning, Hawaii time, Commander Fukita gave the signal that would echo through history. "Tora, Tora, Tora," he radioed back to his fleet, confirming that complete tactical surprise had been achieved. The sleeping giant was about to awaken, and when it did, the world would never be the same. The first bombs began to fall like deadly rain from a clear blue sky, shattering the Sunday morning peace and plunging America into the greatest conflict in human history. The screaming whistle of falling bombs shattered the morning tranquility as the first wave of Japanese aircraft descended upon Pearl Harbor with lethal precision. At 7:58, the torpedo bombers came in low over the harbor, their Kate aircraft skimming just 50 feet above the water's surface, while the Val dive bombers plummeted from above like avenging angels. Aboard the USS Oklahoma, Seaman First Class Stephen Young was climbing the ladder to his battle station when the first torpedo struck the ship's port side with a thunderous explosion that knocked him from his feet. The massive battleship shuddered like a wounded whale as seawater rushed through the gaping hole in her hull. Within minutes, 2 more torpedoes found their mark, sealing the Oklahoma's fate. The USS Arizona bore the brunt of the most catastrophic single attack of the morning. At 8:06, a modified 16-inch armor-piercing shell, dropped from high altitude by a Kate bomber, penetrated the ship's forward magazine. The resulting explosion was so massive that it lifted the 32,000-ton battleship clear out of the water. Seaman Donald Stratton, who had been on the bridge, found himself hurled against a bulkhead as flames engulfed the forward section of the ship. Captain Franklin Van Valkenburg and Rear Admiral Isaac Kidd were both killed instantly when the Arizona's bridge was consumed in the fireball. Of the ship's crew of 1,500 men, over 1,000 would perish in those first terrible moments. The Arizona settled to the harbor bottom, her superstructure jutting above the oil-slicked water like a steel tombstone. At Ford Island's Naval Air Station, Commander Logan Ramsey rushed to the radio room as Japanese Zeros strafed the airfield, their machine guns chattering death across the tarmac. "Air raid Pearl Harbor X, this is not drill," he transmitted, sending the first official word of the attack racing across the Pacific to Washington. His message would reach the highest levels of government within hours, forever changing the course of American foreign policy. The Wheeler Army Airfield suffered devastating losses as Japanese fighters destroyed aircraft lined up in neat rows, their wings almost touching. Colonel William Flood watched helplessly as months of careful maintenance and preparation went up in smoke and flame. The American pilots who managed to reach their aircraft found themselves facing experienced Japanese aviators and superior fighters. Second Lieutenant George Welch and Second Lieutenant Kenneth Taylor managed to reach Hell Iowa Field and get their P-40 Warhawks airborne despite the chaos. These two young pilots would become among the few American heroes of the morning, shooting down several Japanese aircraft in desperate aerial combat. Their courage provided a glimpse of the fierce resistance that would characterize America's response to aggression. According to declassified military records from the National Archives, the Japanese achieved complete tactical surprise due to a series of intelligence failures and communication breakdowns. The warning signs had been present: unusual radio traffic, submarine contacts, and radar readings, but they were either dismissed or failed to reach the proper authorities in time. Petty Officer Doris Miller, meanwhile, had helped move his wounded captain to safety aboard the West Virginia before manning an anti-aircraft gun, despite having no formal training on the weapon. The young sailor from Texas would fire at attacking aircraft until his ammunition was exhausted, displaying the kind of heroism that would inspire a generation. The harbor itself became a scene from Dante's Inferno as burning oil, spreading across the water's surface, created rivers of fire. Ships' crews found themselves fighting not only the enemy, but also the elements, as they struggled to control flooding, contain fires, and rescue their shipmates from oil-covered waters that burned around them. By 8:30, the first wave had completed its deadly work, leaving behind a scene of unprecedented destruction and preparing the way for the second wave that was already approaching from the north. As black smoke billowed across Pearl Harbor like a funeral shroud, individual acts of heroism began to emerge from the chaos of the second wave attack. At 8:54, 171 Japanese aircraft swept in for their final assault, determined to finish what the first wave had begun. Aboard the sinking USS Oklahoma, Seaman First Class Stephen Young found himself trapped below decks as the massive battleship continued its death roll to port. The sound of rushing water and groaning metal filled the darkness as he and dozens of other sailors fought desperately to escape the flooding compartments. Some would remain trapped for over 30 hours before rescue crews could cut through the hull to reach them. Hospital Corpsman Third Class John Harley was treating wounded sailors on the quarterdeck of the USS Tennessee when shrapnel from a near miss tore through his abdomen. Despite his injuries, he continued applying tourniquets and bandages to his shipmates, refusing evacuation until he collapsed from blood loss. His selfless action saved at least a dozen lives that morning. At Hickam Field, Technical Sergeant William Schick organized firefighting efforts as Japanese Zeros continued their strafing runs across the burning airfield. The fuel storage tanks had been hit early in the attack, creating an inferno that threatened to consume the entire base. Schick led volunteers into the flames repeatedly, rescuing injured personnel and preventing the fires from spreading to ammunition dumps. The USS Nevada, the only battleship to get underway during the attack, became a symbol of American defiance as she attempted to reach the harbor entrance. Chief Quartermaster Robert Sedbury had taken the con when the ship's senior officers were killed or wounded. Under heavy attack from dive bombers trying to sink her in the channel, the Nevada fought back with every gun that could bear. As documented in official Navy combat reports, the Nevada's anti-aircraft gunners maintained steady fire even as bombs exploded around their positions. Seaman First Class Ross Romano stayed at his 5-inch gun mount until a direct hit silenced his weapon forever. The ship's band, led by musician First Class Charles Hazelwood, abandoned their instruments to carry ammunition and assist the gun crews. Lieutenant Commander Francis Thomas, the Nevada's damage control officer, made the difficult decision to beach the ship at Hospital Point rather than risk blocking the harbor entrance. His quick thinking prevented what could have been a tactical disaster, ensuring that Pearl Harbor would remain operational for the massive military buildup that would follow. On Ford Island, Commander John Ford, the famous film director who happened to be stationed there, documented the attack with his camera, creating some of the most powerful visual records of the day. His footage would later be used to rally American public opinion and serve as evidence of Japanese aggression. The destroyer, USS Shaw, suffered a spectacular magazine explosion that sent debris raining down across the harbor. Photographer's mate, Harold Fawcett, captured the iconic image of the explosion from Ford Island, creating one of the most recognizable photographs of the Second World War. The image would later appear on countless recruiting posters and war bond advertisements. At the Navy Yard, civilian workers joined military personnel in fighting fires and rescuing survivors. Yard worker Joe George dove repeatedly into the burning harbor to pull injured sailors from the oil-covered water, suffering severe burns that would leave him hospitalized for months. His courage exemplified the civilian contribution to the rescue efforts. By 9:45, the second wave had completed its attack and was withdrawing toward the Japanese carrier fleet. The silence that followed seemed almost more terrible than the noise of battle, broken only by the crackling of flames, the cries of wounded men, and the hiss of water on hot metal. The attack was over, but the rescue efforts were just beginning, and they would reveal the true character of a nation suddenly thrust into global war. The acrid smell of smoke and burning oil hung heavy over Pearl Harbor as rescue crews began the grim task of assessing the devastation. By 10 o'clock on the morning of December 7th, the immediate danger had passed, but the magnitude of the disaster was becoming horrifyingly clear to commanders and rescue workers alike. Admiral Husband Kimmel, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, stood on the submarine base dock surveying the wreckage of his command. The USS Arizona continued to burn, her hull settling deeper into the harbor mud with each passing hour. Oil fires danced across the water's surface, creating an apocalyptic scene that would be seared into the memory of every survivor. Captain Mervyn Benyon lay mortally wounded on the bridge of the USS West Virginia, refusing evacuation while directing damage control efforts. Despite suffering fatal injuries from bomb fragments, he remained at his post until the ship was secured. His executive officer, Commander Roscoe Hillencotter, coordinated the counter-flooding that prevented the battleship from capsizing completely. The casualty reports painted a stark picture of American losses. The battleship Arizona had lost 1,177 officers and men, making her the greatest single loss of life in naval history to that point. The Oklahoma had capsized with 429 souls trapped inside her hull. In total, over 2,400 Americans had perished in less than 2 hours of combat. Petty Officer Doris Miller, still covered in oil and gunpowder, residue from his heroic actions aboard the West Virginia, helped carry wounded shipmates to safety boats. The young sailor from Waco, Texas, had distinguished himself under fire, becoming one of the first African Americans to receive recognition for combat heroism. His actions would later earn him the Navy Cross, though racial prejudice would initially delay proper acknowledgement of his courage. At Tripler Army Hospital, medical staff worked frantically to treat over 1,000 wounded personnel. Army nurses like First Lieutenant Annie Fox organized triage stations and surgery rooms, while bombs were still falling around the hospital. The medical corps, overwhelmed by the scale of casualties, pressed every available person into service, from clerks to chaplains. According to official casualty reports preserved in the National Archives, the material losses were equally staggering. 18 ships had been sunk or damaged, including 8 battleships that formed the backbone of the Pacific Fleet's offensive capability. 188 aircraft had been destroyed and 159 damaged, representing nearly half of the Army and Navy aircraft stationed in Hawaii. Commander Logan Ramsey continued coordinating communications from Ford Island, maintaining contact with Washington as fragmentary reports filtered in from across Oahu. The War Department was struggling to comprehend the scope of the attack, with some officials initially believing the reports were exaggerated or mistaken. USS California, flagship of the Pacific Fleet's battle force, settled slowly into the harbor mud as her crew fought desperately to save their ship. Chief radioman Thomas Reeves remained at his post in the radio central, deep within the ship's hull, ensuring communications remained operational until rising water forced the compartment's evacuation. His dedication to duty cost him his life, but helped coordinate rescue efforts throughout the harbor. Civilian casualties were surprisingly light, considering the intensity of the attack. 57 civilians died, many from anti-aircraft shells that fell in populated areas of Honolulu. The restraint shown by Japanese pilots in avoiding purely civilian targets would later be cited as evidence of the attack's military rather than terrorist nature. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the harbor, the immediate rescue phase was giving way to salvage operations and strategic planning. The Pacific Fleet had suffered a devastating blow, but it was not destroyed. The aircraft carriers Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga had been at sea during the attack, preserving America's most valuable naval assets. The real cost of Pearl Harbor would not be measured solely in ships and lives lost, but in the fundamental transformation of American foreign policy and national consciousness that would follow. News of the Pearl Harbor attack spread across the American mainland like wildfire, transforming a nation's Sunday afternoon tranquility into a surge of outrage and determination that would reshape the course of world history. In Washington, D.C., the first fragmentary reports reached the White House at approximately 1:30 in the afternoon, Eastern Time. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt was having lunch with advisor Harry Hopkins when Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox telephoned with the devastating news. "Mr. President, it appears that the Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor," Knox reported, his voice barely concealing the shock that gripped the entire administration. Roosevelt's initial response was one of disbelief, followed quickly by a grim determination that would characterize his leadership throughout the war. Secretary of State Cordell Hull was meeting with Japanese ambassadors Kishiburo Nomura and Saburo Kurosu at the precise moment bombs were falling on Pearl Harbor. The Japanese diplomats, apparently unaware of the attack's timing, were delivering what amounted to a declaration of war disguised as a negotiating position. Hull's famous response, calling their message infamous falsehoods and distortions, would become part of the historical record of American diplomatic outrage. Across the nation, Americans gathered around their radios as news broadcasts interrupted regular programming with bulletins about the attack. The Columbia Broadcasting System's John Charles daily delivered one of the first nationwide reports at 2:26 p.m. Eastern Time. The Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, by air, President Roosevelt has just announced. In New York City, crowds gathered in Times Square as news tickers flashed updates about the attack. The initial disbelief quickly gave way to anger as Americans realized the magnitude of the surprise assault. Movie theaters across the country stopped their Sunday matinees to announce the news, with many audience members immediately heading to military recruiting stations. The attack's impact on American public opinion was immediate and profound. Isolationist sentiment, which had dominated American politics for 2 decades, evaporated virtually overnight. Senator Arthur Vandenberg, a leading isolationist, would later write that Pearl Harbor ended isolationism for any realist. The attack had accomplished what months of European war could not. It had united America behind the cause of total war. As documented in contemporary newspaper reports, military recruiting stations across the country were overwhelmed with volunteers by Monday morning. In Detroit, Michigan, over 1,000 men had formed lines outside the Army recruiting station before dawn. Similar scenes played out in cities from coast to coast as young Americans sought to enlist in what they now understood would be a global conflict. The economic implications were equally immediate. Stock markets, which had been closed during the Sunday attack, plummeted when they reopened on Monday morning. Defense contractors, however, saw their values soar as investors recognized that America's entry into the war would require massive industrial mobilization. The transition from peacetime to wartime production would prove to be one of the most remarkable economic transformations in American history. President Roosevelt began drafting his address to Congress within hours of receiving confirmation of the attack. Working with speechwriter Robert Sherwood, he crafted what would become one of the most famous speeches in American history. The phrase, "a date which will live in infamy," emerged from Roosevelt's own pen, replacing the original, "a date which will live in world history." In Hawaii, martial law was declared as military authorities took control of the civilian government. Lieutenant General Walter Short, despite his failures in preparing for the attack, coordinated defensive measures against possible invasion. Anti-aircraft batteries remained at full alert, and civilian populations were evacuated from strategic areas. The Japanese, meanwhile, were celebrating what appeared to be a complete tactical victory. Admiral Kiichi Nagamo, commander of the Carrier Strike Force, had achieved surprise and inflicted devastating damage on the American Pacific Fleet. However, strategic analysts in Tokyo were already beginning to question whether the attack had accomplished its larger political objectives. As December 7th drew to a close, America was fundamentally changed. The sleeping giant had indeed awakened, and its response would ultimately dwarf even the most ambitious Japanese expectations. The morning of December 8, 1941, dawned gray and solemn over Washington, D.C. as President Franklin Delano Roosevelt prepared to address a joint session of Congress that would formally bring the United States into the Second World War. The Capitol building hummed with unprecedented tension as senators and representatives gathered to hear what many already knew would be a declaration of war. At 12:30 p.m. Eastern Time, President Roosevelt entered the House chamber to thunderous applause that reflected not political partisanship but national unity in the face of unprecedented aggression. His appearance, supported by leg braces hidden beneath his formal attire, symbolized both personal courage and national determination. The speech he was about to deliver would be broadcast live to a nation hungry for leadership and direction. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. Roosevelt began, his voice carrying the weight of moral authority that would galvanize American resolve. The speech, lasting only 6 minutes, would be remembered as one of the most effective calls to arms in democratic history. Meanwhile, at Pearl Harbor, The grim work of recovery continued under martial law. Salvage crews worked around the clock to refloat damaged ships and clear the harbor channel. The USS Oklahoma remained capsized, her hull serving as a tomb for hundreds of sailors trapped inside. Rescue workers could hear tapping from within the hull, spurring desperate efforts to cut through the thick steel plating. Chief Petty Officer Julius Finnern led one of the rescue teams attempting to reach survivors trapped aboard the Oklahoma. Using cutting torches and pneumatic tools, his crew worked for 32 hours straight, following the sound of metal tapping that indicated life within the overturned battleship. They successfully rescued 32 men from what should have been certain death, though many more perished before they could be reached. The USS Arizona continued to burn, her ammunition magazines exploding periodically and sending columns of smoke high into the Hawaiian sky. Captain Samuel Fuka, the ship's damage control officer, organized efforts to fight the fires and rescue survivors despite suffering severe burns himself. His leadership under extreme conditions would later earn him the Medal of Honor. In Los Angeles, fear of Japanese invasion gripped the civilian population as military authorities implemented blackout procedures and coastal defenses. Anti-aircraft batteries were positioned throughout the city, and civilian defense volunteers began organizing air raid drills. The panic was largely unfounded, but it reflected the genuine uncertainty about Japanese intentions following Pearl Harbor. FBI agents across the West Coast began rounding up Japanese aliens and American citizens of Japanese ancestry suspected of potential sabotage or espionage. This tragic overreaction, which would culminate in the internment of over 120,000 people, represented one of the darkest chapters in American civil liberties history. The fear and prejudice unleashed by Pearl Harbor would have consequences lasting long beyond the war itself. According to declassified intelligence reports, the Japanese had achieved their tactical objectives, but failed in their strategic goal of deterring American entry into the Pacific War. Admiral Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, reportedly told colleagues that Japan had awakened a sleeping giant and filled him with a terrible resolve. His prophetic words would prove more accurate than he could have imagined. Vote in Congress was overwhelmingly in favor of war, with only Representative Jeanette Rankin of Montana dissenting. Her lonely stand against war, which she had also taken in 1917, reflected the pacifist principles that had guided American foreign policy for 2 decades. Those principles were now casualties of Japanese aggression. Within hours of Roosevelt's speech, Great Britain declared war on Japan, followed by Canada, Australia, and other Commonwealth nations. The attack on Pearl Harbor had not only brought America into the war, but had also created a truly global conflict that would ultimately involve virtually every nation on Earth. As December 8th drew to a close, America was mobilizing for what would become the greatest military effort in its history. The road ahead would be long and costly, but the die had been cast at Pearl Harbor. The attack on Pearl Harbor became the defining moment that transformed the United States from an isolationist democracy into the world's leading superpower. Its consequences rippling through history far beyond the immediate destruction wrought on that infamous Sunday morning. The strategic implications of December 7th would reshape not only American foreign policy, but the entire global balance of power for generations to come. In the months following the attack, America's industrial capacity was mobilized on an unprecedented scale. The arsenal of democracy that President Roosevelt had envisioned became reality as factories across the nation converted from civilian to military production. The Ford Motor Company's Willow Run plant began producing B-24 Liberator bombers at the rate of 1 aircraft per hour, while shipyards from Maine to California launched Liberty ships faster than German U-boats could sink them. Admiral Chester Nimitz, who replaced Admiral Kimmel as Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, used the devastation at Pearl Harbor as motivation for one of the most remarkable military comebacks in history. The carriers that had escaped destruction, Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, became the foundation for a new kind of naval warfare that would ultimately prove superior to the battleship-centered thinking that had dominated naval strategy for decades. The human cost of Pearl Harbor extended far beyond the casualties suffered on December 7th itself. The families of the 2,400 Americans killed in the attack became symbols of sacrifice that inspired millions of their countrymen to similar service. Gold Star mothers and widows toured the country selling war bonds and encouraging enlistment. Their personal losses transformed into national purpose. Petty Officer Doris Miller's heroism aboard the USS West Virginia broke racial barriers and helped pave the way for integration of the American military. His Navy Cross citation, which praised his distinguished devotion to duty, extraordinary courage, and disregard for his own personal safety, challenged segregationist policies and contributed to the gradual recognition of African American contributions to the war effort. The salvage operations at Pearl Harbor became a testament to American engineering ingenuity and determination. The USS California and USS West Virginia were not only refloated, but completely rebuilt with modern radar and fire control systems. They would return to action in time to participate in the final battles of the Pacific War, symbolic of America's resilience and capacity for renewal. According to post-war analyses conducted by naval historians, the Japanese attack, while tactically successful, proved to be a strategic disaster of the highest magnitude. By attacking American territory directly, Japan had united American public opinion behind total war and eliminated any possibility of a negotiated settlement. The date, which will live in infamy, had indeed awakened a sleeping giant whose response would far exceed Japanese expectations. The Pearl Harbor attack also marked the beginning of America's permanent global military presence. Naval bases, air stations, and Army installations established during the war would become the foundation for a worldwide network of American military power that continues to this day. The isolationist policies that had characterized American foreign relations since George Washington's farewell address were permanently abandoned. The memorial built over the sunken USS Arizona serves as both a tomb for the sailors entombed within her hull and a symbol of American resolve. The oil that still seeps from her fuel tanks, creating an iridescent sheen on the harbor's surface, is often called the tears of the Arizona, a reminder that some wounds never fully heal but can inspire future generations to vigilance and service. Lessons of Pearl Harbor: the importance of intelligence analysis, the dangers of complacency, and the need for constant preparedness became fundamental principles of American national security policy. The surprise attack that caught America unprepared on December 7, 1941, would be the last successful strategic surprise against American forces in the 20th century. Today, as visitors stand on the memorial above the Arizona's final resting place, they can still see the outline of the great battleship beneath the waters of Pearl Harbor. Her presence serves as an eternal reminder that freedom's price is constant vigilance, and that December 7, 1941, truly was a date that will live in infamy and in the collective memory of a grateful nation.